to present to us today. Tim, we're absolutely thrilled to have you and to kick this off this new semester on a really high standard. So no pressure.
Thanks, Claudia. My way of giving my paper is going to be to take you through slides. I've got, apart from this one, 38 slides to show you, but some of them are very short. But the reason I'm using slides is because I've got quite a lot of numerical data to show you. Now, firstly, I've got to, that's interesting, I can't change the screen. Oh, here we go, yeah. It starts with, well, firstly, I should say that I'm addressing you from Ngunnawal land in Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people. I support the Uluru Statement, as I expect many of you, if not all of you, do, but I'm not sure how we understand one sentence, which is this one: we seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. Do the authors of the statement want a Makarrata Commission to supervise truth-telling about our history? Now, if you go to the Referendum Council's final report for guidance on that ambiguity in the drafting of the Uluru Statement, they give you this gloss. The Uluru Statement called for the establishment of a Makarrata Commission with the function of supervising agreement making and facilitating a process of local and regional truth-telling. So that's one answer to, is truth-telling going to be supervised? Is that the intention of the authors of the Uluru Statement? It's going to be facilitated rather than supervised. So what might be the difference between those two things? When it endorsed the Uluru Statement, the Referendum Council gave certain reasons for endorsing truth-telling. And rather than read this out, I'll let you read it yourself. Okay, so there's a rich international record of transitional justice mechanisms, which include telling the truth about some dreadful things that have happened. I want to go to the next slide. And for some reason, it isn't doing that. Okay. Now, one of the models of truth-telling that has emerged and is known to many people is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. And the Referendum Council reported from its public consultations that at the Melbourne and Adelaide dialogues, the Indigenous public who attended those dialogues expressed support for a Truth and Reconciliation process or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, the final report of the Referendum Council declined to make a recommendation about the institutional form of truth-telling, quote, because it does not fall within our terms of reference. Now, the government's response to the Referendum Council's report was to set up the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This was chaired by Patrickdson and Julian Lisa. You can see what was appointed in March 2018. There was an interim report July, final report November 2018. And I've looked at the transcripts of their hearings, and I've discovered that a few people did mention truth-telling modelled on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was mentioned by the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, and Jackie Huggins, who represented the National Congress, used words like really strong in bringing evidence. She mentioned its powers of subpoena. She used the phrase have teeth. But she also says, but of course we need to refine the model. In other words, she didn't completely endorse the Australian process being modelled exactly on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Jill Gallagher, a figure who I'm sure is more familiar to you than she is to me in Victoria, said that she wished to look at how it was done in South Africa. Dr. Lenore Gayer in Queensland, she was speaking on the Palm Island hearing, said that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission could be a model of truth-telling that was worth considering. And then a man called Thomas Wilkie Black is quoted in the report of the Joint Select Committee as saying that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission demonstrated ways to collect testimony confidentially. So that was a kind of recommendation of that as a model for Australian process. However, the report issued by Patrickdson and Julian Lisa discouraged basing truth-telling on any South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission model. Their formal recommendation was in the first of those two paragraphs, and again, I'll let you read it for yourself. You can see it's fairly unspecific in what it recommends, but one thing that does shine through is the idea that it would be locally based. And in one of his remarks in one of the public hearings, Senator Dodson conveyed his own scepticism about modelling any process in Australia on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's the import of that second quote, which again, I'll let you read for yourself. So my conclusion is that in the reception of the Uluru Statement so far, there is a kind of mild interest in the possibility of modelling truth-telling on the process used in South Africa, but no strong advocacy of that. And indeed, to the extent that anybody is explicit in their judgment about it, someone as influential as Senator Dodson actually explicitly rejecting that as a model. So if there is an emerging Australian model for supervising or facilitating truth-telling, it has these characteristics. It's not a forensic model, but it's oriented towards creating consensus, and often the word healing is used. It's not seeking to identify individual responsibility or liability, though historical individuals, of course, could be named. And it's not national, but it's local. Now, I'd like to just briefly discuss what we mean by the supervision of truth-telling. I think that historical memory and historical practice in Australia is kind of supervised in the sense that there are many, many authorities influencing the way we remember Australia's past. And I've listed some of them here. I call this an ecology of pressures. It's not strictly supervision. Nonetheless, there are ways in which we are, as it were, nudged towards certain orthodoxies or statements that can be accepted without much contradiction, and such things as state-mandated school curriculum, but with a certain amount of teacher autonomy, giving a bit of play there. There's the approving of textbooks, and there are school library purchase decisions. There are decisions about statues and memorials. There are decisions about public holidays and how public holidays are thematized. There are commercial and governmental decisions about what stories to tell on screen, which, because those stories require quite large monetary investments. There is the awarding of prizes, which gives certain narratives status over others. There's peer review and editorial gatekeeping, something which I engage in myself as currently co-editor of Australian Historical Studies. There are publishers' promotions, and I was very struck by this one for Mark McKenna's The Return to Uluru, where Professor Megan Davis said it will form an important part of Australia's truth-telling canon. So Megan Davis thinks that there perhaps is a canon forming about how we can tell the truth about Australia's history. I asked Mark McKenna if he thought his book was part of an emerging canon, and he said he didn't think it was, and he thinks that historians are too disputatious to give much support to the formation of canons. Another set of pressures that helps to, as it were, supervise the kind of truths that we come to accept are decisions about university appointments, a painful subject, I know, in your neck of the woods at the moment, and what courses are taught. There's also decisions about research funding. And then finally, and this is the one I want to talk about today, there's the Reconciliation Barometer, because the Reconciliation Barometer has actually defined a set of truths that should be propagated and understood as truth about Australian history. And they've set out to measure to what extent the public endorses those truths. So, as you may know, Reconciliation Australia runs the Reconciliation Barometer every second year by survey. It gathers survey data on variables that it thinks are relevant to understanding Australians' disposition towards reconciliation. One of the variables is historic acceptance. And Reconciliation Australia argues that reconciliation requires that all Australians accept certain truths about Australia's past. And it says that we can't change the past, but we can learn from it. We can make our amends. We can ensure mistakes are never repeated. Our nation's past is reflected in the present, and unless we can heal historical wounds, they will continue to play out in our country's future. Now, I'm going to propose in this talk that there are broadly two large truthful themes about Australia's colonial history. I'm going to call them Theme 1 and Theme 2. Theme 1 is stories about the colonists' invasion, their land theft, and their subsequent mistreatment of the people whose land the colonists occupied. The second kind of theme are stories about Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians collaborating to build the nation. Both those stories are circulating presently in our public sphere. And I noticed that the Referendum Council's final report endorses both those truths. It says that the true history of colonisation that must be told would include genocides, massacres, wars, ongoing injustice and discrimination. And it found those themes abundantly expressed by Indigenous people that were consulted in their regional consultations. And they're summarised on pages 16 to 21 of the Council's final report. But in a sentence that may be little noticed, the Referendum Council also said that the truths that should be told are stories of how First Nations people have contributed to protecting and building this country, which I take to be type 2 stories, stories about Indigenous and non-Indigenous collaboration to build the nation. It's interesting that the Reconciliation Barometer, when it's tested the public acceptance of certain truths, has investigated the acceptance only of type 1 stories, stories about invasion, land theft, etc. And here are the 7 statements that the Reconciliation Barometer has deployed in its surveys. And I'll let you read them yourself rather than read them out. Okay, so those propositions, one might quibble a little bit with the way some of them are phrased. Did colonisation begin in 1770? One might ask. But anyway, apart from such quibbling, which I'm not going to engage in, there's I'm sure you'll find all those 7 truths familiar. Some people would call them the black armband view of history, though I don't like that phrase myself. Now, I'm going to take you through some survey results, which shows you the degree to which those statements were endorsed by Indigenous and general community samples. And as sort of good methodological hygiene, I'm going to just brief you about these samples. You can see in this table the size of the sample, the general community sample in this column, the Indigenous sample in this column across these years, and the people who administered the survey have calculated the margin of error. So the quanta that I'm about to show you are not any more precise than is indicated in these margin of error figures. And also as a preliminary, I want to just show you the data that was collected when people were asked to rate their own knowledge. And the figures that aren't in brackets are the figures for the Indigenous sample. The figures that are in brackets are the figures for the general community sample. Mostly I'm going to be focusing on the Indigenous sample data in this talk, and I'll explain why later. But if I could just summarise what those figures show us, and I can come back to the table if anybody in discussion, if anybody wants a longer look at it. A higher proportion of the Indigenous sample than the general community sample rated themselves as knowledgeable about Australian history. And the proportion of Indigenous Australians rating themselves as knowledgeable about the histories and cultures of Indigenous Australians is roughly double the proportion of the general community sample rating themselves as knowledgeable. So here are some results. I'm going to take you through the 7 truths and show you in each case that a very substantial proportion of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous samples were unable to endorse them. They either reject them or they say they are too unsure to be able to give an answer. And it's across these 4 years because these are the years in which this question was put. So the statement is government policy enabled Aboriginal children to be removed from the families without permission until the 1970s. You can see that a large proportion, though a diminishing proportion, of the Indigenous sample felt unable to endorse that statement. Next statement. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did not have full voting rights throughout Australia until the 1960s. Again, a large proportion of the Indigenous sample, in fact, slightly larger than the non-Indigenous or general community sample, is unable to endorse that statement, either because they reject it or because they're not sure about it. But they can't affirm it as a truth. Third one, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians were subject to mass killings, incarceration, forced removal from land and restricted movement throughout the 1800s. Again, a large minority of the Indigenous sample did not affirm this proposition. Fourth statement, government policy in the 1900s dictated where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians could live and be employed. Again, a large minority of the Indigenous sample did not affirm this proposition. Australia was owned by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities at the time of colonisation in 1770. In the 2 years in which it was asked, again, a substantial minority of Indigenous Australians could not affirm this statement. Sixth statement, at the time of colonisation, there were at least 250 distinct Indigenous nations, each with their own cultural identities and custodial connections to land. It wasn't asked until the last two barometers, but again, a substantial minority of the Indigenous population, or the Indigenous sample rather, could not affirm that proposition. And the seventh one, again, it was asked only in 2 out of the years. Frontier wars occurred across the Australian continent as a result of Indigenous people defending their traditional lands from European invasion. A large minority of the Indigenous sample did not affirm it. I'm sounding like a broken record. These are very consistent results and very puzzling ones. I was surprised by them, and I've been trying to think about what sense to make of it for a couple of years now. And this seminar is an attempt to get you to help me to think about that. But you might well object that I'm lumping together as not affirming two very different responses. Those who positively deny the truth of the statement and those who are merely too unsure to answer. I agree that that is an important distinction. And although I have lumped them together in order to demonstrate the large minority that cannot affirm or chose not to affirm the statements, I now think that it's time to split those two, split the deniers from those who are merely unsure and consider them separately. And we have a very good empirical reason to distinguish the Indigenous respondents who reject these statements from those who are merely too unsure. And the reason is, as I will explain, it has to do with the change in the wording of the question. In 2014, 16 and 18, the wording was, do you accept or not accept the following as facts about Australia's past? However, after 2018, the pollsters wondered about the respondents' understanding of the word accept. So in 2020, the barometer dropped those words and substituted 3 possible responses. I believe this is true, I do not believe this is true, and I am unsure about this. Now, the effect of changing from accept to believe in the question is generally to diminish the proportion of the Indigenous sample that denies the statements. But the proportion answering that they are unsure about the statement remains the same. So that by 2020, Those respondents who did not affirm the statements were mostly made up of people who were saying that they were unsure. Only about 5% said that they did not believe the statements, a much less surprising minority. So I'm just going to illustrate what I've just said by drawing attention to some of the statements. With the statement, government policy enabled Aboriginal children to be removed from their families without permission until the 1970s. From 2018 to 2020, that is the years in which there was a change in the wording, the proportion of the Indigenous sample that said unsure remained about the same, 14% and 16%. But the proportion of the Indigenous sample in apparent denial of this statement fell from 20% who did not accept to 5% who did not believe it to be true. And a further illustration is this one. The statement, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians were subject to mass killings, incarceration, forced removal from land and restricted movement. The proportion responding unsure was about the same, 15 or 16% between 2018 and 2020. That is, the change in wording didn't make a difference to those who were, the proportion who were unsure. But the proportion in apparent denial fell from 18% who said do not accept to 5% who said they could not believe the statement. So I'm going to pause here and offer some observations about everything I've told you so far. Firstly, that the proportion of the Indigenous Australian sample not affirming Reconciliation Australia's selected truths is surprisingly high, 25 to 40%. And this large minority is not much less than the large minority of the general community sample that does not affirm those statements. Second point, intuitively, we may suspect that not affirming is made up of two distinct orientations: confident deniers of the statements and those who are merely unsure. Third point, I've just demonstrated empirically that the Indigenous and general community respondents do seem sensitive to the 2020 change in the question wording. It made a difference being asked, do you accept a truth and do you believe it to be true? So the new wording, let's say the improved wording of the Reconciliation Barometer in 2020, diminished the proportion of Indigenous respondents not affirming the historical truths presented by the Reconciliation Barometer. Those not affirming these truths in 2020 are largely made up of respondents who say that they are merely unsure what to say. However, in 2020, 1/4 of Indigenous respondents were unsure in response to this statement. Frontier wars occurred across the Australian continent as a result of Indigenous people defending their traditional lands from European invasion. Why would as many as 1 in 4 Indigenous respondents feel unsure when confronted with a truth that I think we would expect every first-year history student to serve back at us as a truth that can't be gainsaid, a truth that can't be denied? So I'm still intrigued, even after the refinement of the question, that there is so much unsureness about these truths in a substantial minority of the Indigenous sample. So what makes people unsure? I'm going to say that it's got something to do with the emotional and political and moral resonance of factual statements. And here I'm following a theme in social theory, which is very authoritatively expressed by a very good paper by Margaret Summers in 1994, which basically argues that narratives and identities are mutually constitutive. So this is my hypothesis, and it's not one that I can test, but it's more of a kind of an intuition that's guiding me in thinking about all this. What is at stake in accepting or believing, rejecting, or hesitating, that is, being unsure about certain historical truths, is the respondent's understanding of their position within a field defined by the binary Indigenous, non-Indigenous Australians. This field, which I'm sure is very familiar to you, it's the language we all use to think about Australia nowadays. This field is widely understood in terms of morally and politically significant narratives. So to pose a question about a narrative, that is, do you accept it or believe it, is to engage the respondent's identity and moral political position taking. So we're not just tapping into people's historical knowledge here, we're tapping into their habitus, to use Bourdieu's term, their habitual position taking, their sense of where they stand in a nation that's defined by, whose past is defined by morally and politically charged narratives that deploy the Indigenous, non-Indigenous binary. Now, a survey such as the Reconciliation Barometer is a very blunt instrument for further investigation of this hypothesis. We'd be much better off doing ethnography and focus groups. But there are some things in the Reconciliation Barometer which encourage me to think along the lines of my hypothesis. And they're the Reconciliation Barometer's questions about forgiveness and responsibility. Firstly, forgiveness. Here is a question that was asked over the last 4 Reconciliation Barometers. In terms of the history of European settlement in Australia, which of the following statements do you most agree with? A, the wrongs of the past can never be forgiven. B, I don't believe there have been any wrongs. C, the wrongs of the past must be rectified before all Australians can move on. D, there should be forgiveness for the wrongs of the past and all Australians should now move on. And the first thing to note is very few respondents in both samples chose B. That is, very few people would say they don't believe there have been any wrongs. So nearly everybody polled in this question believes there has been wrongs. And what is their response to them? Well, the proportion of the Indigenous sample that said the wrongs of the past can never be forgiven was 13 to 16% across those years. And you can see it's significantly larger than the general community sample. The proportion of the Indigenous sample that says that there can be forgiveness, but it must be conditional on rectification was quite large, 35 to 44%. And the third way of thinking about forgiveness, which I would gloss as unconditional forgiveness, there should be forgiveness for the wrongs of the past and all Australians should now move on, 39 to 50%. So a large proportion. And I'll just say a little bit more about those proportions. Nearly all of the Indigenous and general community respondents agree with the question's premise, that is, that there have been wrongs of the past. And so the question of forgiveness is pertinent. The proportion of Indigenous respondents who say the wrongs can never be forgiven exceeds the proportion of general community respondents by a factor of 2 to 3. Not so surprising. The proportion of Indigenous respondents who see forgiveness as conditional, that is, they want some kind of rectification, also exceeds the proportion of general community respondents. but by a smaller factor, 1.5. The proportion of the Indigenous respondents who would forgive unconditionally, that is, they would move on, is substantially smaller than the proportion of the general community. And I'll just show you another feature of this. I'll go back to the table to show you another feature of this question. No, I actually haven't got it in the table. But yes, no, it is evident actually. The Indigenous sample is more evenly spread across the different forgiveness options than the general community sample. And I would say that in their moral thinking about the past, the Indigenous sample is more evenly, it's more heterogeneous in its moral thinking than the general community sample. The general community sample tends to be loaded very much towards the idea, let's forgive, or let's have forgiveness and move on. So the other moral concept that is in the questions asked by Reconciliation Australia in the Reconciliation Barometer is a set of questions that use the word responsibility, which is a very complex word. When the facts of the past are made morally meaningful by associating them with the question of forgiving, conditional or unconditional forgiving, the question of responsibility is also raised. That is, historical statements can be morally meaningful as answers to the questions, what problems of contemporary Indigenous Australians are effects of past colonial misdeeds? And that's one way of thinking of responsibility. Who created this mess? And second way of thinking about responsibility, who should clean it up? Who should take up the reparative burden and fix these terrible effects? So the Reconciliation Australia, or the Reconciliation Barometer rather, asks questions that invite respondents to link the past to what it calls Indigenous disadvantage. And here are some results of that, those questions. A substantial minority, 26 to 32% across a series of surveys of the Indigenous sample, did not affirm that Indigenous disadvantage is caused by past race-based policies. And another substantial minority, 33 to 40% of the Indigenous sample, did not affirm that Indigenous disadvantage is Australia's colonial legacy. And as we've already agreed, those not affirming these explanations consist of two kinds of respondents. Those who deny that responsibility can be sheeted home, responsibility for Indigenous disadvantage can be sheeted home to those past actions, and those who neither agree nor disagree. They're just simply too unsure to give an answer. The Reconciliation Barometer goes further into this question of Indigenous disadvantage, and it lists 9 kinds of Indigenous disadvantage, and it measures people's, or the proportions of people in each sample, respondents in each sample, that, as it were, hold past actions by Australian governments, racist policies and so forth, responsible for creating each one of these kinds of disadvantage. And you'll see that's a fairly familiar list of Indigenous disadvantages.
Tim, I think that your slides are not forwarding. I think we've missed the last 2.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we're still on the responsibility question mark slide.
Okay. This one. Okay. Thanks for telling me that. Now, can you see the next slide now? It should say.
I can't. No.
Or can I?
Okay. Let me go back. I'll try a different part of my keyboard. There. Can you see that?
No.
Proportion of oh, my screen sharing is paused, it says. Now, why is that? Oh, resume share. Okay, yeah. I think I've fixed it. I might have just inadvertently clicked on a button that I shouldn't have clicked on. Thanks for letting me know.
So we're still on the responsibility question mark slide.
Okay. Okay. No, why am I getting?
Yeah,
now,
right.
You've got that? Oh, good. Yeah. Now, I don't know why all that happened. I've got the two bits of software that I don't know very well, Zoom and PowerPoint.
Don't worry, we all know, we've all been there.
Okay. So here are what I'm talking about here is people's acceptance of certain explanations for what the survey instrument calls Indigenous disadvantage. And what I'm pointing to is large minorities of the Indigenous sample that did not affirm that Indigenous disadvantage is caused by past race-based policies, 26 to 32%. Similarly, when asked about Australia's colonial legacy, 33 to 40% of the Indigenous sample did not affirm that Indigenous disadvantage was caused as Australia's colonial legacy. So, as I said before, those not affirming these explanations consist of two kinds of respondents, those who positively deny them and those who neither agree nor disagree. Now, back to disaggregating disadvantage, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. You can see here that the Reconciliation Barometer distinguished 9 kinds of disadvantage, and it asked for people's opinion about the degree to which Australian policies were responsible for each one of them. And there's one that stood out, and that's the last one, lack of personal responsibility. This is if you like, a disadvantage, which, and I'm using the word in inverted commas, which I think has packed into it all the semantic complexity of the word responsibility and all the, if you like, philosophical complexity of the notion of historical responsibility. How can actions by others be responsible for one's own lack of personal responsibility is the question one might ask. What I'm getting at here is that I think that the Reconciliation Barometer used questions which were, in a kind of naive way, tapping into moral reasoning more complex than the survey instrument could possibly get at. It's why we would need ethnography rather than a survey instrument to get at these things. The obverse of the results I've just shown you is that a high proportion of the Indigenous sample, 2/3 to 3/4, did think that past government policies caused these 9 different kinds of disadvantage. The proportion of the community sample agreeing with this cause was not as high. But when it comes to personal responsibility, that is the disadvantage, and I'm using Reconciliation Barometer's language here, it's not mine, the disadvantage called lack of personal responsibility. It was the one that was least likely to be attributed to past government policies. The proportion of the Indigenous sample disagreeing that government policies were a cause of a lack of personal responsibility ranged between 11 and 14% across those years. So, responsibility, I'm sure we'll agree, is a complex word. The Reconciliation Barometer gives us reason to think that many respondents from both samples were actually baffled when asked whether past government responsibilities caused Indigenous Australians lack of personal responsibility. A high proportion over that period, 2014 to 2020 surveys, a high proportion, 20 to 29%, said that they could not or would not express an opinion on that matter. The word responsible is the site of a political enigma, an unresolved narrative linking the past to the present to the future. So here's some more data about how people dealt with the question about responsibility. This is a question that says, ask people to agree or disagree with the proposition, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are responsible for their own disadvantages today. And just have a look at those results and I'll comment on them. Again, the results in brackets is the general community sample. I want you to focus on those not in brackets, the Indigenous sample. So, note the high proportion that neither agrees nor disagrees. That is, people were simply baffled by this question. I wonder what those agreeing were thinking. Were they blaming Indigenous Australians for the persistence of their disadvantage and implicitly urging them to make a greater effort? That is a discourse that you certainly hear. Or were they asserting a claim to empowerment? That is, were they interpreting the question as saying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are responsible for overcoming their own disadvantage and should be empowered to do so? That would be one way of taking that question, and it helps, I think, to know that, to open up the, to cast doubt that we could ever know what people were thinking when they agreed with it. Similarly, when they disagreed with the statement, how were they understanding the statement? And the final thing I'd note about this table is that there's a convergence between the proportions of the Indigenous and general community samples in every one of these cells in this table. So if people are thinking, there's evidence here that not only are people baffled by the question of responsibility when it's presented to them in the way that the Reconciliation Barometer did, but also that the distribution of their bafflement is similar in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous samples. So I'd like to conclude now. The Reconciliation Barometer shows that a large minority of Indigenous respondents do not affirm the truths selected by Reconciliation Australia as necessary to reconciliation. Is that a problem? I say that it is a problem if the Indigenous public is supervising, in the strong or weak sense, the emerging canon of truth-telling. It's always been my supposition that the Indigenous public is unified in its view of what the truth of Australia's history is, and that a project of truth-telling has to use Indigenous opinion as a kind of reference point for whether truth is being told. I think that assumption lies behind much of what I read about truth-telling. But the empirical results shown by the Reconciliation Barometer is that the Indigenous public is not unitary. There are clear majorities, but there are large minorities in their answers to questions about the truth of the past, about how Indigenous disadvantages to be explained, and whether what kind of forgiveness is possible, whether it's conditional or unconditional, as I've illustrated. So I think the Reconciliation Barometer, as I've expounded it to you, does show that the Indigenous public is, as it were, too disunified to be our reference point. So there are two solutions to that problem. Reconciliation Barometer has proposed one solution. It's changed the measuring instrument. It is, as I explained before, it tested its intuition that for respondents, there is a difference between accepting a statement about the past and believing it to be true. And when the wording was changed from accepting to believing it to be true, in 2020, the Reconciliation Barometer showed that a smaller proportion of both samples were not affirming the 7 historical statements. In other words, the change in the wording does bring about, as an effect, a data effect, a greater unification of the responses of the Indigenous public. However, there's still a substantial minority of the Indigenous public, as measured by the Reconciliation Barometer, which answers that they're unsure about these propositions. And so my question is, what do we do with these people? How do we interpret them? Do we just simply discount them as irrelevant? Or do we seek to understand and empathize with them? I'm proposing that we do not dismiss their doubts. And here I want to go back to the Referendum Council's advice, where it said in its final report that the true history of colonisation that must be told would include not only the genocides, massacres, wars, ongoing injustices, etc., but also stories of how First Nations peoples have contributed to protecting and building this country. Both those themes are true, I think, but where should the emphasis fall? The Reconciliation Barometer recognises that the historical statements that it has chosen in order to exemplify truth are morally relevant to the issues of forgiveness and responsibility. The data show diversity of Indigenous and non-Indigenous opinion about the moral and political implications of type 1 truths, so that is, truths about the bad things that happened in the colonial story. But perhaps there are large minorities of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations who would like truth-telling to include, and perhaps even to emphasise, type 2 stories, stories about how First Nation peoples have contributed to protecting and building this country. These stories are also morally and politically relevant in that they encourage identification with Australia as a shared national project. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was certainly, sorry, I'm trying to find a clapping thing. That was very thought-provoking. I think my head might still be smoking a bit because it's running a bit hot. I have lots of questions. Some are not quite clear in my head yet, but I'll see if anyone else wants to